Inflation. Your argument is that when we talk about inflation, we often get it wrong, at least in terms of the impetus and it often in the response. But why don't you just start with basically what is inflation, the way that it's defined popularly, and what is it actually?
All right. So let's do it this way. Inflation, the best ever definition was given by Mrs. Thatcher, and I can never find the source, but I'm sure she said this, which is it's a rise in the general level of all prices. So it's not when houses get maddeningly expensive. It's not when a particular part of the market gets suddenly really expensive. It's when everything goes up. Okay, now, remember last year and the year before, there was this whole conversation about the disconnect between the way that people were feeling about inflation and the official numbers. There's a huge insight in that moment into the whole core of this thing, right? So let's think about it this way. Have you got a glass of water with you, Sam?
No, I've got a cup of coffee.
All right, just go with a cup of coffee instead, right? Imagine we could see through that coffee. When people like me talk about inflation, what we're interested in is the rate of change of the level of prices, right? The delta, if you want to be fancy about it. And that's a bit like looking at the surface tension on the glass of water. Now, if you're a normal punter, you don't care about that. What you care about is the level of water. Now, if the level of water is the level of prices, what people experience is the level was here and now it's here. So when my people say, yeah, but the rate of inflation's slowing, and they say, yeah, but eggs still cost $12, what are you talking about? They're actually more correct, because what they're looking at is the total level of prices. Now, why does this become
It's
even
almost
more
analogous to what happened today with, or I should say, over the past 24 hours with tariffs on China. Putting aside any relationship between tariffs and inflation, if you start at 145 and go down to 30, you're still at 30.
Yeah,
Whereas,
exactly.
6 weeks ago, we were at 10% or zero.
Yeah, or zero,
so
absolutely.
It's
so it's
the
a levels
actual
question. It's a levels question, absolutely, right? Now, why does this matter, and why did you get this big disconnect? Well, you know better than most that we're living in possibly the most unequal economy that we've seen in about 100 years, if not more. So the bottom 60% of the income distribution in the US hasn't had a real wage increase in decades, because inflation's eating away what meager gains they've got. So imagine that you're spending 60%, 70% your disposable income on consumption goods. This is what inflation measures. Why CPI, consumption, right? So the poorer you are, the more you spend. If you're shopping at Dollar General and prices go up 10%, you and your family have to have a serious conversation about what you're going to do without. You're in the top 10%, you're shopping at Whole Foods, you clearly don't give a shit about inflation anyway because you're shopping at Whole Foods. But you also use a much smaller proportion of your income for direct consumption. So the way that people actually feel and experience inflation is hugely different across the income distribution. So the professional classes are looking at the rate of change. Ordinary people are looking at levels. And if you're in the bottom 60, that squeeze on levels really hurts. If you're in the top 10%, you barely notice. And in fact, you're probably winning because if equities are going up at the same time, you're making it that side of the equation rather than losing on the inflation side.
And when we talk about what is measured in inflation, a lot of the things that are measured in inflation, or I should say aren't measured as inflation because they have other drivers of increases that aren't necessarily universal.
Mm-hmm.
Those things tend to be the most important, particularly if you're in that, the bottom 70, 80% of the income distribution.
And this is where rents become really, really painful. I mean, a large part of what's still driving inflationary forces in the US is a long-term problem, which is we stopped building houses for normal people sometime around 1980. And we turned the entire housing market into an asset class. And that's why it's ludicrously expensive. Now, I started by saying that that's not an inflation. Well, it's not. But again, it's about your personal consumption. If you're spending 30, 40% of your income just paying the rent, and basically what happens is the Fed takes rents and adjusts them and plays with them to make them statistically comparable, and they worry about the volatility of et cetera. And then the Fed talks about core inflation, which is you take all these volatile items out. Well, what do they things include? They include things like fuel. They include things like food. They include things like the way rent is adjusted. So essentially, you end up with this figure that looks like 4% or 5%. But people who are paying 40% of their income in rent, they're like, this is not the inflation I'm experiencing. Absolutely not. So again, that disconnect that people felt was very real.
Let's go back to the 70s and talk about inflation then, because one of the things that has occurred to me over the course of particularly watching, the inflationary pressures of COVID and what drove that is there seems to be some type of like a disconnect between the idea that prices are going up and that the fix for inflation seems to be static, regardless of what might be driving it at any given time. So let's, in part, I think your argument is that this is a function of learning the wrong lessons in the 70s.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not even our argument. What happened is this is an ex-central banker and economics professor called Alan Blinder. And he's actually been going on about this for years. He's got a whole series of papers on this. And it kind of makes sense, right? So here's the basic story. When Europe's inflation rates went up in 2022, what happened? Basically, they had no gas anymore. They've been importing it from Russia, right? So suddenly you don't have any gas. You got to scramble for gas. World prices go up. European prices go up, all that sort of stuff. And then your response is, let's look at the labor market and let's raise interest rates. What does one have to do with the other? This is clearly just a big supply shock. You can't get supply, prices go up. Now, interest rates are part of the response to that, because if it is the case that basically these prices are going to go up, you want to chill the economy a bit so it doesn't get out of control, etc. But the fundamental story that we get is it's money that drives these things. There's two basic narratives. The first one is the government spends too much money. This is the Biden stimulus thing, which falls down on the fact that there was one Biden stimulus, but about 30 countries got inflation, so they can't all be blamed on that one, right? Which is not to say that it can't be important, but it can be universally important. And the other one's the labor market. Basically, the labor market's too tight. People are going to bid up wages. Prices will go up. You get caught in the spiral. None of that seemed to actually describe what was going on in 2021, 22, and 23, pretty much anywhere. And to their credit, the central banks figured this out. By about 2023, the European Central Bank figured out that 40% of the inflation they were facing was literally price gouging from companies. And they actually admitted that. But a lot of this comes back to the 1970s. You'll remember Milton Friedman's famous line that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That's the shorthand. That's the shorthand for what we learned.
For the sake of and this may be a little bit rudimentary, but explain to us when we say monetary policy versus fiscal policy, and then these other elements that can drive, logistics, supply shocks, whatnot.
Yeah, so the basic story that I was trying to get at there ham-handedly is the following. We look for monetary causes for inflation, right? And what that means is there's too much money chasing too few goods in the economy. So what you want to do is increase the price of money, the interest rate that jacks up, so that you counteract those forces. But if what's driving inflation is ultimately a series of supply shocks, logistics, ships not arriving, you can't get what you want, what you need, etc., then it's not clear that that's the optimal response. There's going to be other ways of dealing with it. And again, as you said, Sam, this comes back from this particular reading of the 70s, but very interesting, these papers by Alan Blinder challenge us and say, what actually happened was a whole series of discrete supply shocks, everything from fighting the Vietnam War off the books, incorporating women in labor markets for the first time at scale, the same with minorities, failed wheat harvests, oil shocks, all this sort of stuff came along in the 70s, and it lasted a decade. But it was actually a bunch of discrete supply shocks. And if you see it that way, money's not really your problem in controlling the money supply or the interest rates or whatever. It's about adjusting the supply side of the economy so that the inflationary pressures dissipate. And this is kind of when you learn the lesson of the 70s, it's always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. You reach for interest rates. And then we figured out this time around, employment went up. It didn't go down. That wasn't meant to happen, remember? So the responses we got this time were weird, which is what made us kind of start thinking about this.
Okay, and I want to just slow down just a little bit so that people, in starting from the end backwards, the Fed has a dual mandate, and that is to keep unemployment as low or employment as high as possible, but also to keep inflation under 2%, and they can change that target rate at different times. So back in the 70s, the assumption was that people just we had put too much money into the system. Yep. And that there was just too many people had too much cash and they were going out trying to buy goods, but talk about how. Let's just start with Vietnam. You've got a lot of people go into the military. How does that impact? How does that create a supply problem, as it were, either for labor or for anything else?
Well, labor's the easiest one. When you got 500,000 people tied down fighting a war in Southeast Asia, and you don't really want to raise taxes, you're going to have to fund that some way, and you do that by allowing the deficit to rise. When you've got all those people not in America doing things, they're off doing something else, then you're going to have incredibly tight labor markets. That means that anybody who wants a job in that environment is probably able to get a higher paying job. So you're bidding up wages because of the tightness of the labor market. That would be one example as to how this works. Let's take the oil shocks in 74, 79. This is America as a much more industrialized economy. This is still the heyday of manufacturing, et cetera, in the United States. So oil is this input that goes into everything. When you could quadruple the price of oil, the prices that everything comes out the other end of that, they're going to have to be more expensive. So you have all these different forces that are all pushing in the one way, which is basically you've got a fixed amount of stuff in the economy, and you create an excess demand because there's too much money chasing it, and that means prices has to go up. That's the basic story. And it's not completely wrong. It's just incomplete for the moment that we're in.
Well, okay, so why was the response to that? Okay, if you have these different sort of like supply bottlenecks, a supply of labor, a supply of fuel, essentially. If you have these supply bottlenecks, why is it just that the only response is we need to essentially readjust people's expectation and ability to access labor, to access oil or fuel, or access whatever goods that we need? And so the only way that we have to control that is essentially to make them poorer. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what when we talk about raising interest rates, that's what's supposed to happen downstream. Exactly. Is that people have less money.
Which is why it's so interesting that this time we raised interest rates and more people were employed rather than less. So it tells you something weird is going on. But that's exactly the model. That's exactly the way that they're working with it. And, you know, we started this by saying... Was that just like puritanical? I mean,
is that just some type of moral...
No, it makes sense. Think it from the point of view, you got to think of this word expectations. It's not like changing your expectations to access labor or something. The way that we began to think about inflation as a problem in the 60s was really about expectations, right? So if you see prices rising now at a certain rate, what are you going to do? You're probably going to try and buy things now. When you try and buy things now to compensate, what does that do? It creates a shortage, which pushes up the price. So what do you then do? Well, you try and get ahead of it again. So you begin to expect rising prices. And the argument that Paul Volcker made and basically became the wisdom was you got to break these expectations. People have to not expect rising prices. And that's a huge part of the control valve for doing it. Now, the other side of the story on that one is if it's really just a bunch of supply shocks, like eventually you stop fighting the Vietnam War, right? Eventually American industry adjusts to higher fuel costs. You don't need to do that because it's not really a story about expectations. So if you think it's all about breaking the psychology of rising prices, you jack up interest rates, you make people poorer, and that shatters the expectations. But according to Blinder and other people following the supply shock version, you didn't need to do any of that. All those forces were on the way out by the early 1980s. So what you did was you just created a huge destruction of American capital and jobs for no apparent reason.
Well, that to me feels like what happened during COVID. I mean, there is an obvious story as to why.
This is why we went for the book. Exactly, right.
I mean, there's an obvious story as to why we had, inflation. I mean, frankly, you could find this with a lot of different, social phenomena. Like, why is there more crime? Why is there? I don't know. It could be this one in a lifetime, knock on wood, event that just took place. Right. And the fact that a container ship cost 5 times what it did 6 months earlier because it's in some far-flung part of the world and we don't have access to it.
That's exactly it. Now, if we think that, follow that through, Sam, right? What does it tell us? It tells us that it's these, to use lack of a better word, supply shocks, right? Basically, you can't get what you want at the price you're used to. Now you're going to have to pay more. Let's think about tariffs for a minute. What is tariffs? Tariffs are a policy-induced supply shock. Now, usually what you're trying, and this is why the Fed treads very carefully at the moment, right? what you're trying to do if you're the Fed is you're trying to create an economic environment where you don't get big shocks. And now you've got a guy in the White House who's determined to create big shocks. And these are supply shocks. They are making things more expensive deliberately for this project of bringing industrial economy and industrial jobs back to the United States. So imagine a world in which it's not just once in a lifetime events like COVID. We now start to shock ourselves. That means that you're not going to get these once-in-a-lifetime events. Let's think about climate change. What is climate change? Climate change is basically a giant supply shock inducer. Whether it's droughts, whether it's breakdown of food webs, whether it's simply things being too hot to farm in certain areas, all of this stuff coming down the future means that we need to get more attuned to the idea that inflation is going to be around a lot more than it was for the past 30 years.
I don't, what I still can't sort of wrap my head around is that there's, and COVID seems to be, having lived through that period, it seems to be the most obvious example. But if Blinder could see that there was a series of supply shocks, why was there seemingly very little effort, if it's about breaking expectations, to articulate this? Is it just a sense that like no one's going to listen to us anyways? We just need to literally take more money out of people's pockets.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of summarizing, actually. Like, we looked into this in the book. We were like, okay, expectations, right? So it's all based on this weird model whereby the central bank sets these expectations as to what monetary policy will be, which basically means what interest will be and how much credit will cost, right? And then the public internalizes this, and then they adjust it. And they're like, does this really happen? Do people really think this way? Turns out there's remarkably little evidence that actually that is the mechanism. One of the favorite papers I discovered doing the research from this was one from the Bank of Spain. And they basically scraped the web of New Zealand. Who knew you could do this? And they basically looked for people in the financial sector in New Zealand to figure out if they were at least listening to what the central bank was saying. And it turned out you were thousands of times more likely to pass your mate in finance a puppy video than to actually pass around a central bank forecast. So if that's not the mechanism, what is it? And I think, Sam, you've got it, which is essentially, look, if prices are rising too high and it's got something to do with people expecting higher prices, let's make things really expensive so that they calibrate those expectations down. That's basically what the model is. The question is, if it's a supply shock, that's really different from an expectations thing, right? One of the mechanisms in your head, that's what's driving it up. The other one is you just don't have shit anymore and it costs more. Right. And it's not clear that if you're trying to play an expectations game against the supply shock, you're going to win, because the supply shock doesn't care what your expectations are.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.